Tonight on Nova, the controversial B-2 stealth bomber carries a huge price tag, but looks as small as a bird on a radar scope. Military deception, once focused on camouflage and decoys, now tests the limits of modern science.
Narrowband contact, initial classification, possible nuclear submarine, sir.
It's a never-ending game, played in deadly earnest. Disguises of war.
Some time ago, a general observed that all war is based on deception. The date was 500 BC, and the general was Chinese. But although weapons technology continually changes, the truth of that observation has not. To those who study deception today, it's a science. To those who are required to practice it, it is still an art. But now, deception has a new name, employing new and exotic technologies. They call it stealth. Tucked away inside the Air Force hangar where it was built, this is the latest and most controversial manifestation of stealth technology. It's the B-2 stealth bomber, and it emerged from the black world of maximum security into the glare of public scrutiny in 1988. Despite its size, this unusual-looking aircraft is claimed to be practically invisible to the host of sensing technologies that an enemy might use to detect its presence. Special radar-absorbent materials, active electronics, and above all, its unorthodox shape are designed to ensure its survival in hostile skies. Ironically, the stealth B-2 is already engaged in a fight for its life here at home. At a flyaway cost of over $550 million each, it now seems very likely that no more than a third of the original order of 132 of these aircraft will be built. Whatever the final outcome for the B-2, military strategists will continue to argue that being effectively invisible will always put you at a considerable advantage in combat, as it has always done, on land, sea, or in the air.
We can go back to the First World War and actually see examples of aircraft technology where the intent was to deceive an opponent, to hide the aircraft, or to cause confusion in the minds of an opponent. There were some attempts to actually develop see-through fabric coverings that you could put over the wings and fuselage of an aircraft to render it, quote, invisible, end quote.
Unfortunately for the pilots of these skeletal early stealth aircraft, the idea backfired. The see-through coverings glinted brightly in the sun and drew attention to the aircraft rather than hiding them. The First World War spawned many new ideas, most of them unpleasant. It was a war waged with increasingly lethal technology, technology that excelled at delivering death over great distances. That was why, in this war to end all wars, the British Army finally relinquished the traditional but highly visible scarlet tunic for a less distinctive brown serge. It was given the name khaki, after the Urdu word for mud. And it was during this war that the word camouflage was first coined by the French. It comes from the verb camoufler, meaning to play a practical joke. In 1917, an unlikely selection of portrait painters, theatrical designers, and conjurers helped to set up the first British camouflage units. Their humor and seemingly limitless ingenuity produced a variety of practical jokes, played out in deadly earnest on an unsuspecting enemy. Before long, both sides were becoming increasingly sophisticated in the art of deception, unaware of the science that lay behind it.
Well, when we see things, when we recognize an object or a person as an identifiable separate thing, psychologists, I think, would say that we see that person or thing as a single unit, separate from a background or separate from a context, to some extent. And if we don't see it as a separate unit, then we simply don't see it. It becomes invisible.
Psychologists call this the hidden figure phenomenon, used to great effect by many leading artists. This black and white photograph also contains a hidden figure. If you know what to look for, the Dalmatian dog is quickly identified and then never lost. But if you thought that was easy, try this. Another black and white photograph, again of an animal. It may help to know that it's looking out of the screen at you. No? It's a white cow with black ears standing in front of a farmyard fence. Got it? And in this painting, we can all see the fox, but can you see the Indian on the horse? As artists experiment with our perceptions of foreground and background, posing the problem of which is which, they are experimenting with the very stuff of camouflage. Now, although a camoufleur can never make an object truly invisible, what he can do is to make that object indistinguishable from its background.
What he wants is for the enemy soldier to walk upon a camouflage scene and to see very clearly that it's a non-threatening pastoral scene and that there's no camouflage here. Now, embedded in that is some very wonderfully deceptive confusion, but it's so wonderfully confusing and so successful that the enemy soldier doesn't even realize that it's occurring. I think we're all familiar with that particular kind of camouflage. There's another kind which is equally interesting, maybe more interesting. And in that case, we're not so much concerned with the background as with the figure itself. And what we do is that we paint that figure in such a way that it is highly different throughout its shape. And so that it begins to look like a hodgepodge or a patchwork or a crazy quilt. It looks like an array of disunified, random, crazy things that don't belong together. And no longer does it look like a coherent unit. And that particular kind of camouflage has been given all sorts of funny names. The French called it zébrage, after the zebra, I guess. The Americans called it razzle-dazzle, and the British called it dazzle painting or dazzle camouflage, which is the name that it's usually given.
Dazzle camouflage first saw service in 1917, when Royal Navy Lieutenant Norman Wilkinson persuaded the British Admiralty that abstract cubist patterns should be employed to confuse the captains of that other First World War innovation, the submarine. The results were, in every sense, dramatic. These are the original full-color dazzle paint designs produced by Wilkinson and his team. Of those who saw these vessels at sea, one sailor observed that it looked like a cross between a boiler explosion and a railroad accident, while another described it as the best camouflage I have ever seen.
Well, I think at first it was regarded as being apparently crazy because people couldn't believe that something so blatant, so loud as a dazzle camouflage scheme could actually assist in the concealment of an object, even a huge object like a ship. But I think that eventually, in fact very quickly, Wilkinson was accepted. His ideas were accepted by the British. And the reason being that they began to study his demonstrations. And they found out that it became much more difficult for the German U-boats to determine the precise speed and direction of the ship. And as a result, less than 1% of dazzle-painted American ships were ever hit by torpedoes.
For this reason, dazzle-painted ships survived into the early years of the Second World War, although it's said they offended the aesthetic sensibilities of some of the Navy's top brass. Eventually, dazzle painting was phased out as other threats to shipping, such as air attack and radar, were introduced. On land, increasingly elaborate deceptions were taking place. At first glance, this French chateau is clearly ruined and therefore harmless. And yet it concealed a front-line Luftwaffe bomber base which remained undetected until the Allies stumbled upon it after the occupation. But Germany's deceptive powers were not confined to a few aircraft hangars. Until 1942, the shape of Hamburg's inner harbor had been a telltale aiming point for Allied bombers. So the Germans moved the aiming point almost a mile northeast, covering up 60,000 acres of water with false roofing. The Allies also undertook large-scale deceptions, painting whole airfields to look like the surrounding plowed fields and pastures. It's said that some of these schemes were so successful that pilots had difficulty landing on them. In California, conscious of the threat of carrier-based Japanese bombers, Lockheed asked the neighboring Disney film studios for help in concealing their huge aircraft factory. The resulting fake suburbs have become legendary in the folklore of the deceptive arts.
Deception, as we call it in the Army, plays a very large part in counter-surveillance overall. Counter-surveillance has basically got three sections: camouflage, concealment, and deception. Of course, you can deceive in two ways. You can either try to make him think that you're not there, or try to make him think that you are there when you're not. And the deception area is one where there are vast historical precedents, some very large deception operations, particularly during the Second World War. But since then, certainly in the United Kingdom, there's been a decline in the interest in deception, although that is now being reversed. We're looking at the moment at a range of tank decoys, which can be easily rolled up, stowed on the side of the tank, and when deployed, they're two-dimensional, they are extremely realistic at threat ranges.
Decoy tanks enjoy a special place in the affections of the Army. Had it not been for decoy tanks in North Africa, suitably camouflaged of course, Montgomery and the 8th Army might well have had a much tougher time fighting a less confused Rommel and his Afrika Korps. Decoys of almost any kind, it was found, create confusion, buying time and lives. Toward the end of the war, decoy Spitfires on decoy airfields with decoy buildings and landing lights were proving to be so successful that the Luftwaffe bombed more dummy airfields than real ones.
4 men can erect one dummy in 10 minutes, and a crew of 6 can easily set up a squadron overnight.
The persuasively deceptive power of decoy aircraft is such that all the technologically advanced air forces of the world still use them. Surprisingly, research has shown that these decoys need not be particularly faithful and expensive reproductions of the original aircraft. They simply need to be just good enough.
The decoy is designed to fool the attacking pilot, who first acquires the target at a range of 2 or 3 kilometers. At that distance, the decoy looks very much like a real aircraft. In addition, you have to remember that the attacking pilot only has a few seconds in which to examine the whole scene, not just the decoy. And so when he sees something that sticks out like a sore thumb, he goes after it. And as long as it's reasonably close to what he is expecting to see, that's what he goes after. And by the time he decides, "Oop, I'm on the wrong target," it's too late for him to retarget.
He'll only have as little as 3 and as most 7 or 8 seconds to actually acquire his target and strike it. In that time, he's seen the field from a relatively large distance, and the detail available to him is very restricted. He's also very busy at that moment, in the sense he's flying an airplane and trying to manage the various parts of the weapon systems involved.
The Soviet pilot who is coming in is being asked to lay down his life or risk his life in attacking an airbase. He may be less anxious to do so when he realizes he could be targeting a $20,000 decoy instead of a $20 million aircraft.
But Air Force psychologists have found that you may not need the $20,000 decoy at all. Maybe all you need is the shadow of the aircraft.
So from a distance, what you see is an outline of the aircraft, of a three-dimensional aircraft that is only 2 dimensions. And during tests that we've done, we have found that pilots actually go after the 2-dimensional silhouette in preference to the aircraft because of the higher contrast and because it's easier to catch and spot.
Some of those tests are conducted here at a scaled-down airfield known affectionately as Strudelheim.
Visually acquire 2 aircraft which will be parked on the hangar aircraft parking pads that you're familiar with. Once you acquire those 2 aircraft, immediately press the response button on your flight stick, which will stop the zoom cart, and then call out the location of those 2 targets. Okay.
Wearing an eye patch to remove the errors introduced by stereoscopic vision, this subject is part of an experiment designed to test how pilots see and how their vision can be fooled. Flying towards Strudelheim at a scale speed of 400 miles per hour, the orientation of the airfield exactly mimics how it would appear to him on a low-level bombing run.
Targets at location 3 and 7.
Almost as an extension of the principles that make decoys and fake shadows effective, researchers here have found that even jagged and irregular shapes painted on the concrete hangar bays will make aircraft detection extremely difficult. Full-scale tests of this principle at U.S. air bases in Germany have been dramatically effective, although camouflage experts nowadays acknowledge that they cannot rely solely on fooling an enemy's vision. Vision, particularly trained vision, the Mark II eyeball as the British Army calls it, is remarkably sensitive, but only for the familiar colors of the rainbow. For millions of years, our eyes have bathed in the light energy given out by our sun, and they have evolved to respond to a limited number of wavelengths. We cannot see the energies beyond red or violet. But there are other energies either side of this tiny physiological peephole in what is known as the electromagnetic spectrum. Energies that today's camoufleur has to know about.
Until the Second World War, basically, camouflage was largely in the visual band. That was where the main threat was. In fact, really the only threat. Today, we believe that about 75% of information on the battlefield will be gathered visually. But of course, since the Second World War, we've seen the expansion into the near-infrared part of the spectrum, the far-infrared, the radar, and for certain applications into the ultraviolet part of the spectrum. So we now have to cover a much broader band of the electromagnetic spectrum.
For the designers of today's camouflage coverings, that means that the heat-masking sheets, the nets, and the false leaves must not only be arranged in such a way as to mimic the shapes, patterns, and colors of nature for the human eye, they've also got to look the right color to non-human sensors. For foliage, that turns out to be a particularly tricky problem because of the rather unexpected reflectance characteristics of a chemical in leaves known as chlorophyll. In the presence of sunlight, chlorophyll converts carbon dioxide and water into starch. That's what it's there for. Coincidentally, at least as far as the tree is concerned, it also makes its leaves appear green. Chlorophyll absorbs every visible color except green, which it reflects, and that is why we see the leaves that color. Leaves also reflect the sun's energy very strongly in a region of the spectrum beyond our vision known as near-infrared. So nowadays, any camouflage worth its salt has also got to reflect sunlight in the near-infrared region of the spectrum. But the camoufleur's problems don't disappear when the sun goes down. On a clear night, Even the tiny amounts of infrared energy from moonlight and starlight are sufficient to illuminate a scene if you've got the right equipment. Amplifying the available reflected energy 60,000 times, image intensifiers can extract crystal clear pictures from the darkest depths of the night. So today, even when a soldier might have thought he was under cover of darkness, he still has to use camouflage screens to be sure he's safe. A little further along the electromagnetic spectrum, beyond the near-infrared, is a region known as the far-infrared. Rather than being simply reflected light, these are the energies that warm bodies themselves radiate. In recent years, cameras have been designed which can see heat, and military technologists have found them particularly useful for seeing camouflaged or concealed vehicles and armor. In this scene, the human eye rapidly begins to lose track of the visual clues that will help to identify what's going on. But since the thermal imager sees not color but heat, it's not confused by the similar greens and browns. The two soldiers and their jeeps are conspicuous throughout the exercise because of the ability of thermal imagers to detect them, using both near and far infrared energy. One of the oldest and most reliable deception techniques of all used to be smoke, literally the fog of war. Thermal imaging cameras, however, can quite easily see through smoke. They ignore the tiny and relatively cool particles in the smoke and register the heat radiated by the tank instead. To the naked eye, the tank is invisible until it breaks cover and emerges from the smoke. Since many battlefield anti-tank weapons now utilize thermal imaging, smoke was obviously no longer of very much protection on its own. So a series of experiments were conducted to find a solution to the problem. It was discovered that by adding a simple and readily available chemical to the standard smoke, a chemical which absorbs infrared energy, the effective and long-serving smokescreen could be given a new lease on life. Now, in addition to masking this Jeep visually, the modified smoke will also screen it thermally. But there's more to thermal imaging than simple detection. Battlefield intelligence relies heavily on surveillance, and heat, it seems, can be very revealing. An average night in an average country town. To the naked eye, this young man on his way home soon disappears from view. But to the thermal imaging camera, it might just as well be day, since he himself is illuminating the scene with his body heat. No matter how deeply he goes into the shadows, the thermal imager will find him. And because of the way hot objects cool, the picture from a thermal camera can be most informative. This car has been parked here for about 8 minutes. How do we know that? Its hood is still hot, and yet its warm tires have cold patches on them where it was parked. And what about that young man who left the pub and walked off down the street? What could be deduced from his thermal portrait? Well, the tips of his ears and the end of his nose are still black with cold, and therefore it's a certain bet that he was in the pub for less than 2 minutes. Now, when applied to military intelligence, this capability of thermal imaging becomes extremely useful. Some of these aircraft have flown recently, those with the white-hot engine stripes. But some are still black cold, indicating they've not flown within the last 12 hours. And of these 6 reconnaissance aircraft, 2 have obviously flown recently, while the other 4 have not. This is a heat snapshot of half a day in the life of an airbase. At sea, the infrared problem is considerably more serious for those in surface ships who would like to be stealthy and remain undetected. Even at night, a ship is a single hot object on a cold, flat, empty sea against a cold, flat, empty sky. For any enemy equipped with infrared sensors, it's what's known in the trade as a sore thumb target.
Infrared is a fairly major problem, particularly coming from gas turbines. And we run Brazen, of course, on gas turbines. They push out a lot of heat. They're running on air. And what we've got to do is we've got to reduce the signatures pushed out by this ship, which help people detect us and, of course, identify us as well.
But for Captain Perrone and his crew, being identified by people is less immediately worrisome than being caught in the sights of an infrared-guided missile. The next generation of heat-seeking missiles will be doing calculations such as these for any hot target they find. If the resulting classification fits the missile's pre-programmed expectations, then it will lock on, home in, and strike. But if it can't find that central hot spot, it won't know what to do. That's why tomorrow's warships will have curiously bulky funnels, shrouded in water cooling systems and cold air blowers. But like all future military equipment, those warship designs will have to address more than just the infrared threat.
You never know what seeker head's coming towards you. I mean, you may be able to say it's an Exocet, but you don't know which Exocet head it is. But of course, you don't know whether it's been modified since the last one came towards you. So everything you have to do, all your countermeasures, have to be robust. And the expression we use is non-threat specific. There is no point having a button on the bridge which is useful for only one particular missile because you don't know whether it's Harpoon, Silkworm, Exocet, Gabrielle, or whatever that's coming towards you. In fact, it might be all three.
This is the infamous Exocet, guided not by infrared, but by radar. In any future conflict, stealth experts agree that deceiving an enemy's radar may determine the outcome. That's why so much research goes into understanding how it works. Radar is a kind of light energy. The word stands for radio detecting and ranging, and it's a term which refers to a region of the electromagnetic spectrum beyond the ones we've seen so far.
We talk about radar seeing things, but radar doesn't see things the way we do, because we see things in a world that's saturated with visible light. Radar doesn't do that. Radar can only detect the energy which it itself has transmitted and which has then been reflected by the target and received back to the transmitter. That's a lot more difficult than just looking out and seeing something that's emitting energy. Therefore, what a radar sees is influenced as much by the material that an object is made of and by the shape of an object as by its physical size. And you could build something the size of the Empire State Building, and if you made it out of the right sort of material and you made it the right shape, the best radar in the world could not see it.
But until recently, naval vessels were made of the wrong materials and were the wrong shape to avoid detection by radar. To make matters worse, they are bristling with their own radars, each of which is declaring, "Here I am," to any enemy who cares to tune in. How then do you make a big ship stealthy?
If I want to make it look smaller, what I first of all have to do is to identify the sources of radar cross-section. Now, these tend to be areas on a warship, or in fact any platform, where three surfaces meet at right angles. And it's this 90-degree angle, the radar reflector, that is the real problem.
When a radar pulse is reflected from any surface joined by a right angle, it behaves as if it were bouncing off a mirror. In the past, ships have tended to be littered with right angles, and this has had the effect of producing very strong radar echoes.
So what we try and do is we identify on a ship all the areas that have high returns and get rid of them. Now, how do you get rid of them? The obvious thing to do is to take them out with a screen, a plate, destroy that 90 degrees. It is quite amazing how the radar cross-section will be reduced just by a very small change in the 90-degree angle. So you take your slab-sided superstructure, which you've cleaned off, and make it lean in. It's called tumble home, and you end up with the ship with sloping sides. Actually, I think they look very attractive as well. But from a radar point of view, it reduces the radar cross-section very dramatically, just by literally sloping in the sides and getting rid of all the 90-degree angles. It's very effective, uses no power, and you've got it as long as you've got the ship.
It's a lesson the Soviet Navy has clearly already learned. This, the huge missile-carrying Kirov, actually has a smaller radar signature than many frigates. The Kirov also makes extensive use of absorbent plastic coatings on everything that might otherwise reflect radar energy. For submarines, too, a stealthy coating is crucial, although now it's sound rather than radar that is the means of detection. That's why most submarines are covered in thick rubber soundproofing tiles, although this elderly Soviet submarine is missing a few from its nose. Today, a new generation of Soviet submarines is taking to the deep. This 600-foot rubber-clad monster weighs in at 30,000 tons, the size of a cruiser. And those who have to hunt this Leviathan, known as the Typhoon, grudgingly acknowledge that Soviet submarines have become extremely stealthy.
They have made significant advances in recent years and are now making very much quieter submarine platforms. And if we go back a few years and we look at their early generations of nuclear submarines, the Hotels, Echoes, Novembers, really quite noisy beasts. And we enjoyed the luxury of being able to detect them at quite long ranges.
And detecting other submarines is Commander Walker's mission. His vessel is a nuclear-powered submarine hunting submarine. Once on patrol beneath the stormy North Atlantic, his sonar operators will search for the faint, telltale sounds of those Soviet subs.
I have the submarine.
I say you have the submarine cleared for its combination, Captain.
Check all masks fully lowered.
Check all masks fully lowered.
Open at 3 and 4 main vents.
Open at 3 and 4 main vents.
Like the quarry they stalk, the British Navy's hunter-killer submarines also have thick rubber skins. This, of course, isn't only to help the sonar operators hear more clearly, because as Commander Walker points out, sound is not only his weapon, it is his enemy as well.
Every submariner has it drummed into him right from day one of his training class that noise kills. And so therefore they operate within the submarine quietly. We don't bang doors, drop heavy objects on the deck, and are just generally aware of the effect that noise can have on us. But of course that doesn't mean to say that we're a silent order. There is a lot of background noise within the submarine. Now, to stop that noise being radiated into the sea, we take great care to ensure that first and foremost the equipment is working correctly, that it is resiliently or flexibly mounted to stop noise being transmitted directly through the pressure hull. And indeed another form of protection, preventing noise from being radiated into the ocean, is through the use of cladding, dampening material. It's a permanent 24-hour-a-day, 7 days a week matter. It also depends on the manner in which the submarine is operated. It is very easy by a fairly cowboy cavalier approach of throwing the submarine around at high speeds and using large angles of wheel or plane to make cavitation, which is the real giveaway.
Cavitation is caused by the propeller. At certain speeds of rotation, it will generate thousands of tiny bubbles in its wake. These bubbles of water vapor only exist momentarily before collapsing behind the turning propeller blade. As they collapse, they create a distinctive hissing noise like a boiling kettle. To see what's going on more clearly, scientists use stroboscopic lighting to freeze the motion of the spinning prop. By studying how and when cavitation occurs, they hope to design propellers that will never sound like this. That is the sound of a submarine propeller cavitating, and it can be detected hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Cavitation doesn't do the propeller much good either, since the bubbles cause pitting, which in turn makes it cavitate even more. Propellers can generate sound in other unhelpful ways too. As the speed of rotation on this propeller is changed, it begins to resonate. The result can be very unstealthy indeed. It's called singing.
This is caused by vortices shed from the trailing edge of the propeller, alternately from the pressure side and the suction side. And if this frequency coincides with a natural frequency of the propeller, it can produce a loud singing noise. There are treatments which can be applied to the trailing edge, which we call anti-singing trailing edge treatments, which can completely stop this. So a well-designed propeller will not sing.
And if cavitation and singing aren't enough to keep the propeller designer busy, there's a third bad habit that unstealthy submarine propellers display. It's this distinctive sound, known in the trade as blade rate noise.
The propeller, unfortunately, runs in a wake behind the vessel. And if you think of a submarine, it normally runs behind the control surfaces, the rudder and the hydroplanes. And each time the blade passes behind one of these, it produces a small thump. This is transmitted to the submarine, and it can make the submarine vibrate. If you get everything wrong, it'll be excited at its natural frequency, and the movement of the bow and the stern radiate quite a large amount of noise at this blade rate frequency.
Analyzed together, these faint but distinctively different sounds can provide a submarine sonar operator with a remarkably accurate idea of exactly who or what is generating the noise.
New narrowband contact, bearing red 30, true bearing 250, strong tonal contact.
The sound frequencies are displayed visually on these passive sonar screens, and to those who know what they're looking at, the message is clear.
Red 30, true bearing is 250.
Strong total contact. Signal classification, nuclear submarine.
Roger, cut the contact through. Cut through the new contact, Roger.
Oslo Watch Ops.
What's the watch?
Sonar holds a new contact, sir. Red 30, true bearing 250. Narrowband contact, initial classification, possible nuclear submarine, sir.
All Soviet submarines are put into various classes for their propulsion plans, and it's just a question of the more information we gain on the screens, the more we can narrow down the classification. Sometimes it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. You have to look through all the mushy noise to try and find the piece of noise that you want to find.
The reason for that noise being so mushy is that sound can travel for enormous distances underwater, but often at different speeds. This depends on the temperature of the water, how salty it is, and indeed whether the water itself is moving in a current. In such a confusing sound environment, therefore, shouldn't a submarine be practically invisible?
Now, I don't think it is ever possible to totally achieve invisibility by plumbing the depths of the ocean, although obviously there are significant advantages to be gained in terms of oceanographic environment and of being able to use and hide behind layers within the ocean.
Stand by target, sit trap.
If we're wishing to evade detection, we can use our knowledge of the propagation of sound in that water mass by getting ourselves into a position where we hope that the sound that we have made will have been bent away from the target and deflected.
Submarines are definitively stealthy. They function best when nobody else knows where they are. That's why everybody is continually looking for them, analyzing the restless sounds of the ocean, waiting for them to betray their distant presence.
Our detection ranges that we achieve here and ranges that submarines or other vessels will achieve on us depend daily on the conditions of the water. And they will vary from thousands of yards to hundreds of miles, or certainly 100 miles.
300, reduce 1 line.
Right, put your contact SC. Contact 6, which bears 329.
Today, the world's submariners have a worrisome array of weaponry stacked against them. Sonar buoys are dropped into the sea above them. Listening devices crisscross the ocean floor in many parts of the world. And now even the effect they may have on the Earth's magnetic field can be detected. And once detected, helicopters will be rapidly dispatched to drop intelligent torpedoes in their approximate vicinity. Like underwater guided missiles, these torpedoes will be left to figure it all out and finish them off.
Weapon in the water, dogbox expiry is minute 29.
It's a submarine stealth that makes it such a valuable asset and such a potent enemy. Indeed, ever since its invention, the submarine's unnerving ability to exploit the element of surprise has caused a host of bizarre and imaginative countermeasures to be invented. One of the strangest was designed to address the problem that bomber crews were having with U-boats in 1942. It seemed that because the aircraft were so slow, a watchful U-boat captain had plenty of time to close up the hatches and dive to safety once the bombers had been spotted. Something had to be done, and Project Yehudi was born.
Project Yehudi started actually by the U.S. Navy in the 1930s, and it was an attempt to make aircraft visually, actually invisible, disappear. And as crazy as it sounds, it turned out to be a highly successful program. It was a concept of putting a bunch of lights along the leading edges of the wings of an aircraft, on the nose of the aircraft, on the engine nacelles, and adjusting the intensity of those lights to match the natural background of the sky.
Psychologists call it isoluminance, the perceptual condition under which different objects displaying similar brightness seem indistinguishable from each other and their backgrounds. To test the Yehudi theory, volunteers from the British Army undertook to cloak their armored personnel carrier in bright lights. On the face of it, the Yehudi principle seems ridiculous, and yet it really does appear to work. As you draw back from the Yehudi-clad armored personnel carrier, the camouflaging effect becomes all too apparent. In 1942, the effect for Navy bomber and U-boat captain alike was dramatic.
It turned out that the aircraft could actually come within perhaps a mile or even less before it was detected, and often that was because of the noise of the engines. And that wasn't enough time for the submarines to submerge. The problem for Yehudi was the fact that airborne radars came out at about the same time, and it was no longer necessary, so it kind of went back into obscurity.
Radar had been developing rapidly during the war. At first, all it offered was a high-level defense against the Luftwaffe bombers. It was called the Chain Home System, and its sky-high aerials were landmarks around the country. But the raiding Luftwaffe pilots learned to fly under the new radar, shadowed by the terrain and the Earth's curvature. As a result, newer, more powerful equipment was devised. Bill Sweetman again.
Radar came on the scene very quickly in the course of World War II. It totally changed air combat for the simple reason that a radar, whether it was in a fighter or on the ground or on the ship, could not only tell what direction you were in, as a human observer might be able to do, but it could also very accurately measure your range, and because it could measure the rate at which your range was changing, it could measure your speed. And this gave it the ability to predict where you would be next. So radar and spoofing radar rapidly became the most important aspect of air combat.
At the time, spoofing involved scattering 10-inch long strips of reflective metal foil, known as chaff, into the atmosphere to jam the German radar screens.
At the same time, some people started thinking about the idea of attacking the problem at its source by making an aircraft less visible to radar.
One of the first of these radar stealthy aircraft was the Mosquito, known affectionately as the Wooden Wonder. It was found to be virtually undetectable on radar. Across the Channel in Germany, even stranger aircraft were being built. These are the original blueprints for a top-secret all-wing fighter. Its design was little short of revolutionary, and its streamlined shape would have made it extraordinarily stealthy even in today's terms. This is the second prototype. It crashed shortly after this photograph was taken. At the end of the war, the third prototype was confiscated by Allied military intelligence for analysis. Today, it sits alone in the corner of a hangar near Washington.
What we're looking at behind us is the dismantled remains of the third prototype of the Horten 9, which was a fighter aircraft that was under development in Nazi Germany toward the end of World War II. And the significance of this aircraft was due to go in production as an interceptor, was that it was an all-wing aircraft without any vertical surfaces. It was jet-powered, and what they were primarily looking for was the best aerodynamic efficiency that could be obtained. A byproduct, of course, of this kind of a design is the fact that you essentially have almost a two-dimensional surface, and you eliminate many of the normal radar reflectors that exist in a typical aircraft, which is a very complex three-dimensional shape.
In addition to its unusual shape, the Horten, like the Mosquito, was almost entirely built from plywood, bonded with what turned out to be a radar-absorbent glue. And like today's B-2 bomber, its engines too were buried deep within the wing structure. But the end of the war closed the book on the Luftwaffe's flying wings. Had any of them flown in combat, they would have been curiosities, but one in particular could have changed the course of history.
Actually, I believe they flew about 7 different designs, flying wing designs. There was also a long-range strategic bomber that was in the design stage at the end of World War II, which was going to be powered by 6 jet engines. And in conjunction with the theoretical development of a nuclear bomb by Nazi Germany was intended, of course, to eventually be used to attack the U.S.
Ironically, it was the U.S. that took up the flying wing concept and developed it. This is the massive 8-engine YB-49. Originally proposed in the year the Horten 9s were being built in Germany, Jack Northrop's jet-powered flying wing first flew in October 1947. But it was an ill-fated project that soon lost favor with both the Pentagon and Congress. It was said to be unstable and difficult to control. Even with 8 engines, it was thought to be underpowered. When the second prototype broke up in flight the following year, questions began to be asked about its structural strength. At the time, the huge B-52 was being developed, and in the early 50s, the flying wing was shelved, some people thought forever. Today, nearly 40 years later, the flying wing concept has been reborn as the B-2 stealth bomber. This time, Northrop's flying wing uses 4 computerized control systems to ensure its stability. Indeed, flight tests are showing it to be a well-behaved and efficient aircraft. But why return to the old flying wing concept at all? The answer, it seems, is entirely based upon the need for stealth.
If I have a radar looking at an object like the B-2, then very little energy is going to go back from that object to the radar. It has all the geometrical guidelines that you would use, so from that point of view, it's been well designed. From the point of view that I can't actually radiate the engine intakes, because they've screened those by putting them high up and down ducts, then again I get no information from that point of view. I believe that an aircraft which needs to carry out the mission that the B-2 needs must be stealthy. If it is not stealthy, it will not get through. And therefore, if it's $600 million to carry out that mission with an aircraft, it has to be stealthy. It has to look like the B-2.
Aside from Batman's private jet, it's difficult to imagine a more unusual shape taking to the sky. Thanks to that shape and the smoothness of its contours, the B-2 is said to have the radar signature of a medium-sized bird. The theory goes that this extraordinary machine can slide unseen into enemy airspace, deliver its weapons, and return without ever being detected. Can the possession of stealth technology therefore truly act as a lasting deterrent?
Nothing is eternal in the world of technology. So you should really look at stealth technology as the next step in a continuing competition between our penetrating bombers and Soviet air defenses. Now, eventually, stealth technology is going to become vulnerable. What kinds of defenses might be developed against it is difficult to say. There are a lot of different possibilities, some of which the Pentagon itself is studying as a possible defense against Soviet stealth aircraft.
But whatever the role of stealth technology in the future, for the moment, the fate of the exotic B-2 is uncertain. Its critics, and there are many, are now choking on more than just the enormous cost of stealthy sophistication. Today, the B-2's clearly offensive mission seems embarrassingly inappropriate and aggressive in a world whose borders are now patrolled by glasnost and perestroika. Of course, the world was a very different place when this super-secret project began over 11 years ago. Today, the extreme secrecy that veils these so-called black projects, and therefore their budgets, is being called into question.
A large percentage of Air Force programs are black, and I think that they've made a conscious decision to do so because it helps get programs through the initial stages of congressional debate. But now that history is really hurting the program because one day, finally, the Air Force was forced to announce the price of the bomber program, and it really shocked a lot of people, especially as it came at a time when our defense budgets are declining and we have a terrible federal budget deficit problem. And that has really been responsible for a lot of the criticism of the bomber program. So secrecy is a two-edged sword in this case.
But here at the Tonopah Air Force Base, while the stealth bomber fights for its life in the corridors and meeting rooms of the Pentagon and Capitol Hill, one of the blackest, most secret stealth operations ever conducted by the military continues. Tonopah is home to the now infamous F-117A stealth fighter. For over 8 years now, squadrons of these aircraft have been flying missions in U.S. and foreign airspace. Nicknamed the Wobbly Goblins by the pilots who fly these ungainly craft, these tiny jets are said to have the radar signature of a BB pellet. They achieve this remarkable characteristic partly because of the materials from which they are constructed, but mostly because of their design. It incorporates numerous carefully angled flat panels or facets, each of which reflects radar away from its source, rather like the naval vessels we saw earlier. The F-117A's mission is to attack communications command and control positions. That's why it's often called a blinder rather than a fighter. To many, the F-117A is the acceptable face of stealth.
Stealth technology is a great thing in the military. It's going to change, at least temporarily, the balance between air attacks and air defenses, aircraft and air defenses. But that doesn't mean we need to put it on a strategic bomber and spend $70 billion doing so. There are a lot of other uses for stealth technology to which it would probably be more appropriate.
The cost of deploying that technology on the B-2 seems outrageously high. But as events unfold on the geopolitical stage, could the ultimate cost of rushing to abandon such an innovative weapon system be even higher? Even skeptical strategists admit that, appropriately deployed, the technology of stealth has a place. After all, as the Chinese general observed 2,000 years ago, all war is deception.